So, okay, so the things you'll need to make this cone are glue. So either glue sticks or Elmer's glue, or if anyone has a hot glue gun, like in those YouTube videos, that's even better, but you don't need one of those. So you need that glue of some kind, and then Scotch tape, and then you need the cone template that I sent everybody. So this thing here. And then I would strongly recommend, if it's possible, to get some poster board, which is a kind of cardstock, so that you can easily get that at Staples or anything like that. You can also, if you have a file folder, that's what I'm going to use. So what do we call this? That weight of paper, that's much better than printer paper, because if you make a cone out of printer paper, it'll kind of work, but it'll be a little bit flimsy and it won't catch the light as well as you want it to. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do with my cone template is I'm going to just cut this out. And I like to I like to walk through these demonstrations. If this is obvious to anybody, I apologize. I'm sure it is obvious, but I know my video demonstrations aren't always as slick as things you'll find on YouTube. Maybe if someday let's hope this doesn't happen, but if we have to just continue indefinitely doing online classes, they'll eventually get all the equipment necessary to do slick demos. So I'm just cutting out this template. Now I'm going to take my card stock, or in my case, I'm going to take my file folder and place it here. And then I'm going to trace that template again on the file folder. And I'm going to do this carefully so that I have a crisp, accurate tracing of the shape. Now you'll notice here it gives, the cone template gives an area where you need to glue. So I'm going to mark off that area on the cone I've traced. On my file folder / poster board. So now I have my cone traced on the poster board, and I marked off here the area that's going to be glued. And so then I'm just going to cut that again. So as I'm handling this poster board, I don't want to grip it too tightly so that I start to wrinkle or put, slight folds in the poster board. I want to avoid that as much as possible because I want to try to have as perfect a geometric cone as I can make. So I say as perfect because we're probably not going to end up with a perfect cone, but as perfect as we can. Okay, so I've gone from my template printed out to the cutout template, and then I traced that onto my poster board, and now I have this shape with an area marked off where I'm going to glue it. So okay, so I have now my template here. And the first thing I'm going to do, just to get this started, you can't just immediately sort of like fold it in and have it work. So I'm going to have to sort of finesse this a little bit. In other words, I'm going to have to start. I don't quite know how to describe what I'm doing, but I'm just manipulating the paper a little bit so that the paper wants to start turning into a cone. So it's not going to quite, so when you first start doing it, you're going to get this type of thing, which is not going to work. But that's what the paper wants to do, right? The paper wants to go back to its flat shape. So you have to just, again, I don't quite know how to describe what I'm doing here. I'm just sort of finessing the paper, just manipulating it so that I'm getting the paper to start to, in a way, this sounds a little bit like I'm giving the paper a life of its own, but I'm just sort of moving the paper around, folding it towards a cone shape, almost as if I'm getting the paper to want to do what I want it to do. Eventually I get it there, and I get it to the place where it's holding on to that shape, that cone shape. I'm able to fold the paper around so that I can overlap the paper where I've marked off the glue area. So now I'm going to take my glue that one, that's old. There we go. I'm going to take my glue and I'm going to glue the part of the paper that's going to be or glue the part of the poster board on the cone that's so what I've done is I've applied glue here along that edge, and I'm going to put plenty. I think a glue stick works better than Elmer's glue. I might be wrong, but I just feel like it does. So now that's glued, and to hold the cone initially while the glue is setting, I'm just going to put 2 tape tabs on it. And then I'm just, now that my paper's ready to do this, and again, in effect, wants to do it because of the way I've manipulated it, I'm going to just turn overlap the edges and just get these parts of the paper to meet up. So I'm starting to get close to a perfect cone here. And where the paper overlaps, I want that to be as perfect as possible so that it's creating, something close to a perfect circle at the bottom. Again, just adjusting these overlapping edges on the paper. You have to do a little bit of work. Again, a little bit of manipulating to get it to meet up. But now I have what is a workable cone for me. So I'll put it on this. So that's a decent cone for our purposes. What I just did is close enough. I didn't do exactly what is done in those YouTube videos, but you can certainly use those YouTube videos. What I did is close. I'm actually just making a slight adjustment here. And actually the cone that I used in the demonstration that I recorded last fall is a cone exactly like the one I just made. I did exactly the same thing. I didn't buy a cone for this class. I have a bunch of cones at Queens College, but so in this time around, my cone's a little bit, I don't know if you can see this, but it's not quite perfect. There's a little bit of a gap there, but that's okay. I mean, if you get it near perfect but not quite perfect, it's going to work for our purposes. So that will certainly work. One of our classmates, I hope Rochelle doesn't mind me saying this, she emailed me last night and asked if it was okay to use a paper party hat that's turned inside out. And that is certainly okay to use. I thought that was a great idea. I had never thought about that. I haven't done it myself. Did you do it, Rochelle?
I didn't pick it up yet, but my mom's gonna get me the party hat.
Yeah, so I think that should work. Okay, so let's see, where are we here? Okay. So I mentioned last week that one of the most important parts of our class is going to be the study of light. Okay, so we're going to be, for every painting we do, we're going to be talking about light. That's what we're going to concentrate on today. We are going to talk about, the first thing I'll talk about in the demonstration or the video I have is how to set up your area, your painting area. We'll talk about the paint we're going to start the semester with, which is very simple, black and white. And we're going to talk about how to start thinking about light. So we're going to be very explicitly thinking about light and how light falls on objects. In other words, how do we see the light that is falling on objects? How can we understand that? And how can we use that to make as convincing a painting of a three-dimensional object as possible? So I'm going to share my screen and we'll go right in to a slide talk about light, and then I'll start the demonstration. So in all these demonstrations will be posted All of these will be posted on our Blackboard channel. Okay, so again, the first thing we're gonna be doing this semester in our study of painting is making a painting of a very simple object using black and white paint as a way to primarily study light and shadow. We'll also be talking about how to perceive and represent value relationships, or accurately perceived value relationships. The first thing I want to introduce, though, is just light as we experience it for the most part in our lives now. So I just randomly found this image online this morning of an office interior. And this is something like the way we experience light in our daily lives, which is to say that we take light for granted, we don't think much about it. It's sort of everywhere all the time, right? So this is an office that could in some ways be a stand-in for many of the rooms that we're currently occupying now, or that we typically occupy in our daily lives. So we walk into a room, we turn on whatever lights are available, even when there's light coming in through windows like we see here in this image. We often, I would venture to say that most rooms are equipped with some kind of overhead lighting coming from multiple directions. There's other kinds of lighting. There's light emanating from computers. There may be light, recessed lighting coming from different sources. We're sort of surrounded by light. So we take light for granted. It's always present. We never think about it. In this class, we're going to be thinking about light a lot. I'll also say that I shouldn't be surprised by this, but I'm often surprised by the fact that many painting classes don't even address light. Many painting classes will walk into a room something like this, with a big bank of windows and lights coming from every different direction. And light is never discussed as the element of the physical world that allows us to see objects. And so we're thinking about how we can very convincingly represent what we see on a flat surface. So we're going to be analyzing how light allows us to see objects, or what light does to objects when light falls on the objects we're looking at. So we don't think anything about light, right? Light for us in the contemporary world is something we just take for granted. Give me a second. My cat is wants to go into another room. I want to get him out of here. Stop bothering us. Go. It's not my cat, it's my kid's cat. I want to make that clear. Okay, so we looked at this image last week. This is a painting that's in New York. And so again, I want to emphasize, I highly recommend everybody take the time to see it. In my opinion, for what it's worth, it's one of the great paintings ever made. And we'll talk more about it. But so this is an example of, what do I want to say? We take light for granted in the contemporary world. That is far from always having been true. So at one time, light was in a way a precious commodity, in the sense that there was no easily achievable light source at many points in a person's life, at many points throughout a person's day, right? Unless they were outside all the time. But if you weren't outside all the time, you were faced with the challenge of how to create enough light to get done what you needed to do. So typically, people would have to have a significant light source coming from a window. And because windows at one time were actually something that were very expensive to have in dwellings, it was unusual to have more than one or at most two per room. So we see here an image of a 17th century domestic worker in the home of a middle-class merchant, probably, or that's what we're supposed to be looking at, doing her daily work next to an open window. And this is an image of this person adjusting the light coming in the window. So they have a single source of light here, and every object in this room is responding to that single light source, right? So we have light coming in from the left, and then you'll notice that all of the objects in the room, including living objects, so this worker's arm is illuminated by the single light source. There's a light side and a dark side, or a light side and a shadow side. As the white cloak she's wearing, or the white, whatever this is called, as it's facing the light, it's illuminated, and as that object turns away from us, it goes into shadow, just like every other object in the room, right? Her head has a light mass and a dark mass, the headdress, light mass and a dark mass. The light and shadow on the headdress gets a little bit complicated. We see more values from a lightest light to middle values to darks. And so if people remember, just so that we're clear, when I say values in this context, I mean degree of lightness or darkness. So this is a very light value. This is a very dark value. This would be a middle value, okay? So the values are more complicated on the headdress. Why are they actually, so let me ask, just so people are looking and thinking about this, why are the values more complicated on this headdress than on this figure's arm? What's causing that situation?
The fabric of the headdress.
What about the fabric?
Like it's a clothing, so it could be constantly moving, but the arm is like, it's always one shape, but the headdress isn't.
Well, so I think what you mean is that there are, because the headdress is fabric and it has a certain wrinkling to it, it has more planes. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, that's true. So this is one sort of, it's a kind of cylinder, right? A cylindrical form, or it's a little bit like the cone we're going to be painting today. It's a relatively simple form. So we have a more simple light and shadow situation, where this is in a sense a more complicated form, made up of a series of planes that slowly turn into one another. So when I say plane, and planes and planar structure is another thing we're going to be talking about a lot in this class. We can see that the form of the head wrap is made up of a more discernible sequence of planes that slowly turn into one another. So a plane being a relatively flat surface, so one plane shifting to another plane that turns away from the light into a third plane, and so on. And then there are smaller minor planes within those larger planes. So that's certainly true. That's one reason we see more of a complexity of values on the headdress. There's one other thing about this fabric that's creating a more complicated light situation than what's happening on her arm. Can anyone see what that is? And we will encounter this kind of situation. What makes for the more complexity of both of values? So in other words, multiple values. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We see a whole range of values. We're really on the arm, we see 2, 3, but it's a much more simple value situation. What is it about the nature of the fabric that's creating a greater complexity of value, also color, than we see on the arm?
Professor,
Go ahead.
is it because the fabric is maybe, it maybe looks wrinkled a bit? And
Well,
that creates for different shadows, for the different colors.
yes, the wrinkling in it is one thing, but I'm looking for one other thing, and that's an important part of it. So that's true. Like when light is hitting, when light is hitting this object here, this object is massive enough, so her arm is massive enough so that it's not allowing any light to pass through it. But that's not actually 100% true on a body part, because some light does pass through body parts. Certainly some light passes through the skin and it gives certain color. We're able to see certain colors. Like, I don't know if people can see, we see a little evidence of the figure's fingers on this side of the window. And you'll notice often, not always, but often our extremities are redder than the parts of our body closer to the core. And that's because the skin is usually thinner in those areas. It's more delicate. And so we actually see light passing through the skin, picking up some of the pigmentation of our blood. It's literally something we see. Or that's part of the reason our extremities read as a little bit warmer and a little bit redder than other parts of our bodies. But for the most part, there's no light passing through this arm. There's no light passing through this wall. There is light, however, hitting the side of the headdress that we can't see, so sort of around here, and then light passes through. So the light is not completely blocked, so we get variations of value. So as light hits the side of the headdress here that we can't see, it passes through and creates this lighter value, as opposed to this part of the headdress where the mass of the head is blocking light from passing through. So when an object is somewhat translucent, not transparent, but translucent, meaning it allows light to pass through, or allows sunlight to pass through, we can get a greater value of color and also a greater complexity of value in color. So anyway, back to our initial point for looking at this image. This is a good example of the way for centuries people were not thought about maybe, but were conscious of light. We're extremely conscious of the presence of light, and primarily dealt with light as emanating from a single source. And that's how we're going to be working with light in this class. We're going to be setting up situations where our light is coming from a single source, as opposed to coming from every different direction, as is probably happening for most people where they are. It's certainly happening for me where I'm sitting right now. And so we're not going to be doing that because an artist always has to work with light that way. We're going to be doing that because that's the best way to understand how light operates when it hits objects. So in addition to people being much more conscious of light, just because of the reality of the world they lived in at the time and the technological situation, they were much more aware of light. Light was also, of course, much more, had much more of a symbolic significance for people before, certainly before the 18th century, before the 19th century. I think to a large extent, we all living in contemporary technological, digital consumer culture, we think much less about light in symbolic terms than people thought about it at one time. So it's less present in our consciousness and in our sensibility. Okay, so this is a painting by a French artist named Ang. His last name is spelled Ingres, in case anybody's interested in looking into him further. This is this would be typical of a student painting from the late 18th century, early 19th century. So Ang was 20 when he did this painting. And it's as advanced as it is, because at this time, if someone was going to be an artist in their life, they probably would have started training when they were around 12 or 14, something like that, and gone through a long apprenticeship, and then started a kind of rigorous course of study, which eventually led at later stages to making paintings like this, which they would then transition into more complex compositions with multiple figures. But so this is a painting the artist did when he was around 20. He was studying with another artist who's an important figure when you're studying art history, named Jacques-Louis David. I don't know if anyone's familiar with his paintings. So again, this is a study done by the young Ang. And it's both a study of a figure and a human figure understood according to a kind of classical concept of the human body. In other words, the human body, the artist is looking at a model posing for the students, but interpreting the model so that the model is understood in some ways through the lens of classical sculpture. So classical, meaning Greek and Roman, aesthetic sensibility was still very important to artists at this time. And so the artist is studying the human body, and in a very careful, rigorous way, the artist is studying how light falls on the human body and how light allows us to see very clearly the three-dimensional volume of the human body, and then gives us the information and the tools to create a very convincing illusion of that three-dimensional volume on a flat surface, right? Which is what we're going to be trying to do. We're going to be trying to take a flat surface and make viewers believe that we're not looking at a flat surface, but we're looking at a space with a fully resolved three-dimensional object in it. So the artist has set up the figure so that the figure is underneath a light source coming from the left, right? It's what we call a raking light source. So the light rakes across the form. And what happens when we create a situation like that is we have the light, we can understand it in very simple terms. There's a primary large light mass, right? So on this complex object of the human figure, it's a kind of complex shape of light. So all of this is light. And then there's a very simple dark mass. So we're dealing with light mass and dark mass. And then what happens, what are the transitions that happen as that light rolls across this form? So we get a sequence of variations to the light, right? So when part of the form, so let's say the plane of the pectoralis muscle, pectoralis major muscle, or the chest muscle, so this relatively flat area of the body, that's a plane on the human body that is essentially parallel to the light source. So this plane is parallel to the plane of the light. So that's the part of the form that's most strongly illuminated, along with any planes on the body that are parallel to this plane. So the plane of the cheekbone, again, the plane of the pectoralis major muscle, some of the smaller planes on the body that are also parallel to the light source. In other words, this flat plane is relatively in line, square to or parallel with the plane of the of the window from which the light is coming. And probably in this studio, or certainly we can tell from the evidence of the painting, the window was high on the wall, so coming down in this direction, the light's coming down in this direction. So this plane on the body is the most strongly illuminated because it's facing the light source. As planes on the human body start to turn away from that light source, we are able to see them less clearly because less light is falling on those planes. So this slight variation on the movement of the chest area, where there's a slight turning away from the light, that drops down in value. So we can't see that part of the body as clearly. This plane, this little squarish plane here, or rectangular plane, that's turned back a little bit more strongly towards the light, not quite as strongly as this plane. We see with a little bit more clarity, it's a little bit lighter still. But then along this line dividing the main planes of the body that are facing the light source, as opposed to the main planes that are turned away from the light source, the body drops into shadow. And what in effect happens is we have less ability to see the body here. Right? We can make out some information, but we see it with less clarity. The color is less apparent. Our eyes make out less information. So the body drops into this big shadow mass. It doesn't, however, go into total darkness, right? We can see some information over here. So the question is why? If no light is hitting this body anymore, why can we see things there? So I'm going to throw that question out to the class. Why are we still able to see information on this part of the body that's no longer facing the light source? And so if we just think about, our what's probably for everybody, really including me, a very basic understanding of the physics of light, we probably all know that we only see objects in the world if light is hitting the object and then reflecting back to our eye and eventually to our optic nerve and eventually to our brain, so that an image of what we're looking at is registering in our brain. But there has to be light for that to happen. So if no light is hitting this part of the body or this part of the body, why can we see anything? Can anyone try to figure that out? Like, why are we seeing some information here?
Because light reflects off any objects that might be on the other side of the figure that reflects off and hits the body.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. So there's no direct light hitting this part of the body. There's no direct light hitting this part of the body, but there's light, there's something called ambient light. There's light passing by the body, hitting off whatever wall may be on the other side of this figure or objects in the room, and it's reflecting back into the shadow side, right? So when light hits another object and then reflects back into other objects, the light loses some of its intensity. Some of that light is absorbed. So reflected light doesn't have the same intensity as direct light. In fact, it has nowhere near the intensity as direct light. But that doesn't mean it's not doing some work to illuminate those elements of objects that are in shadow. So the right side of the figure, which is in shadow, is getting reflecting light. And so we're able to see certain parts of the body that are receiving reflected light. So if we look at the figure's arm, we see a difference within the shadow mass. So let's start looking for light masses and shadow mass. So we have this long, irregular light mass on the planes of the arm that are facing the light source. And then we have this long, irregular shadow mass on the planes of the arm that are turned away from the shadow source. So why do we have a difference in color and value for that matter, from here, the lower part of the forearm, compared to here, the upper part of the forearm, and then the front plane of the biceps muscle. Why is that color and value different than this color and value?
Because of the angle that the arm is at, so more of the upper bicep flesh might be rotated outwards towards it. So just that angle, the way that it falls.
So you mean, so this part of the arm is rotated more towards the light?
Yeah, so when you have your arm, if you were to have your arm like that, this part of your arm would be slightly more forward than the inner part of your forearm, which is reaching further back. So it's just like, it's like the Z axis of like the painting, like what's further back in the background technically would be like the end part of like the forearm, or like the wrist.
And so that would be darker, the
Yeah.
further back it is?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's, I mean, that's good thinking. It's not quite right though. So it's not, but I like the way you're thinking about light and the relationship of objects or planes on the objects to the light sources or to the light source. But it's not quite true actually that things on the planes that are further away from us are necessarily going to be darker. We do see some parts of this body that would suggest that, like this part of the torso is darker, and this part of the torso is further away from us than this part. But actually this darkness here is not actually just a result of this being further back in space. And it's not quite true that this part of the bicep and the joint here is lighter because it's more turned towards this light source. But it is closer to another light source. So what are the light sources we talked about in this painting? There's the direct light, right, coming from the window. And then there's reflecting light. Right, so why might this part of the, so thinking about reflected light, Nancy, why would this part of the arm be both lighter and warmer than this part?
Because it's reflecting off the, I like my first thought when it was the reflected was I don't think it would be reflecting off of his own body, but that's why I'm confused as to why the bottom part is a little bit darker, because if I figured if it was like reflecting off the wall, it would be a little more even, maybe.
No, so it is actually reflecting off his body.
Okay.
So that's what's happening. So this part of the upper arm is much closer to the surface of his body. And this part is actually further away. And we actually see here like the point where the body stops reflecting onto the arm. And so not only is this part of the arm, the shadow in the arm, lighter because it's closer to this reflecting surface, right? That kind of turning egg-like surface of the torso. But the reason this color is slightly redder is because, in part because when light reflects off of a surface, it actually picks up some of the color of that surface. Like sometimes we'll say that it inherits some of the color it's reflecting off of. And we're actually going to see that when we work more with color. We'll see that very clearly once we start knowing what to look for. What's happening is the light reflecting off the skin. It's also passing through the translucency of the skin, and again, picking up some of the chroma, some of that warm color. I said chroma. Chroma and color are in a way synonyms. It's picking up the warmth of the flesh and reflecting that warmth back into the shadow mass. So this is an artist who's very carefully looking at light, how light falls on a form, and then exactly how light, what happens to light as it rolls around that form. So one thing, I'm going to move on to another slide in a moment where we can talk about this more clearly. I just want people to note for a second. So let's look at the light mass, shadow mass. So on all of these forms, light mass, shadow mass, there's a smaller shadow mass as the chest muscle turns in towards the breastplate. But notice on both of these large forms, so the large form of the torso, not to mention the large form of the head, there's along the shadow edge, there's a slightly darker, slightly bluer sort of band of darker shadow. And it's more apparent in some areas, it's less apparent in others. That happens when you get to the complexity of a organic form. We get that long band of shadow here. We're going to start to notice that darkening of the shadow along the shadow edge. That's called the core of the shadow. We'll talk about that more in a moment. Notice here as the shadow ends right here, and then we get this tone that's sort of halfway between the light and the dark. We can call those midtones or halftones. So we're going to be looking for light, shadow, core of the shadow, midtones or halftones. We're going to be looking at reflected light. We're going to be talking about highlights. So we're going to be identifying all of the elements of light and shadow. As we're looking at the objects we paint under light sources. As the semester goes on, we'll also talk about the color of light. So before we get a little bit more in depth into the mechanics of light and shadow, I just want people to notice the difference in the color of the light from this Monet painting. So a Monet painting of haystacks to this Monet painting of a little, what do we call this? A little recess in the landscape. Why is first of all, what's the difference in the color of the light from these two paintings, from one painting to the next? Like, how would we describe the color of the light here compared to the color of the light here?
Well, it's a lot warmer in the haystack picture. It's a lot. It almost seems like, you know, it's in as far as like temperature, as far as color, warmer colors, warmer tones. And then the other one, it's a lot colder. It's a lot cooler. It feels like it's maybe the afternoon. It's a little, you know, later in the day, or it's early in the day, before the sun comes up, maybe.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. This is a much warmer painting, right? And it's because Monet paid attention to the warmth of the light. So these are haystacks that are being directly hit by the light of the sun. So the light of the sun is a warm light source. I don't think it's a question necessarily of the time of the day. This, on the other hand, let me just first say, before I pick up on that again, this is a much cooler painting, and that's the result of a much cooler light source under the conditions that Monet was painting this. But I don't necessarily think it's the time of the day as opposed to what? Like here we have sun directly hitting objects. So we get a very warm color range. We get a very warm, we would refer to this as a warm color palette. We get very warm colors, right? This kind of hot orangey color of the hay, very warm green color of the field. What might account for the cooler light in this landscape situation? It might be time of day in part, but what else? What makes the light outside cooler at times than at others? Like today, the light outside is very cool.
So see if there was like a large shadow thing.
If you're in a large shadow mass, you would have a cooler situation. So often when the light source is warm, like we have here, the shadows will often be cool. So notice how on this haystack, for example, the light goes from the warmth of the plane hitting facing the light source to a relatively cool color here, particularly in parts of this. The color almost takes on a kind of purple, a purple hue. So it could be, I don't think that's what's happening. Although in general, actually, Rochelle, you're right. We could talk about today we're sort of all in shadow, but what's causing that? Like what's the situation with the weather that might make the difference between a warm and a light cool, a warm and a cool light source?
Clouds.
Clouds. So if it's a cloudy day, we don't get the sun directly hitting objects. The light of the sun has to pass through what's essentially a filter of clouds. And so that as the light passes through the clouds, its color changes and its temperature becomes relatively cool. So this is a more, I think primarily the difference is this is a much cloudier day. Just again, before going on to what we're going to be primarily dealing with today, if the planes on this haystack facing the light source are warm, because the color of the light source is warm, what possibly creates a situation where why is that color relatively cool? And notice that many of the shadows, not all of them, so particularly not here, these shadows are not cool. These shadows are almost a kind of fiery orange. But this shadow, this cast shadow is cool. These shadows are cool. These shadows are cool. The shadow on, I think what's a house over here on the roof of a house, that's cool. Why are those planes cool? What's causing that relatively cool sort of bluish violet color in those shadow masses? So if we go back to this painting, this relatively warm color is happening because the light's bouncing off the relatively warm color of the skin. And it's actually picking up some of the color of the blood as it passes through the translucent layers of the skin. Where would the light be getting some of this cool bluish tones?
Object that could be not seen in the painting, that's the light's reflecting off of.
Yeah, but actually, yes, for sure. But actually, we do see the object that the light is reflecting off of, although we don't usually think of this as an object, although it is an object. It's the largest object in this landscape, like the largest, most dominant object in the landscape.
Is it the ground?
It's not the ground in this case. Notice the direction these planes are facing. So this plane is facing up, right? Like the angle of that faces up. This ground plane, like if we think about what that's facing, is facing up. So what's the source of that cool bluish color? What's the biggest, bluest mass in this landscape or in any landscape?
Sky.
The sky, right? These planes are facing the sky. So actually what does happen, even though, I mean, sometimes this seems counterintuitive because we don't think of the sky, it's hard for us to think of the sky as a reflecting surface, but actually the atmosphere of the sky does in a very subtle way reflect the light back, and it picks up that cool blue color that we see in the sky. And that's reflecting light back into these surfaces that are directly facing the sky. Notice that these planes on the haystacks are actually facing the hot surface of the the hot surface of the ground plane. So warm light is reflecting back in to these planes on the haystack. So this value on the haystack is, or this color in the shadow of the haystack is different from this color. And one last thing I think is worth pointing out about color and light when we're looking at objects. So I want to make a distinction in the way we talk about color. So if we use the term local color, well, first of all, let me ask everybody, does anyone here ever heard the term local color or know what that means? Okay, so local color is the kind of conventional color idea or color name that we assign to an object. So what I mean by that is we say that the sky is blue, right? That's the local color of the sky. Trees with leaves on them are generally green, right? So these trees back here, we can call them green. We're talking about the local color. The local color of a haystack is a kind of light brown, right? Or tan, we might say. That's the local color. But local color has very little meaning for us as painters, or only in certain situations. Because if the local color of this haystack is beige or tan, right now, under the lighting situation we're looking at, we actually don't see beige or tan at all. What we see is a whole range of different colors that are influenced by the color temperature of the light, by the colors of reflective surfaces, by the sky, and the direction those planes are facing. So this plane of the haystack is a warm orangey, maybe this we could call a beige, right? Because the more light there is on an object, if the light is a relatively neutral color, in other words, it's not strongly colored one way or another, then we'll see something closer to the local color. So in this part of the haystack, we're getting close to what we would call the local color of the haystack, although it's a very warm, orangey version of that local color. We don't see that local color at all anymore over here. We don't see it at all over here. This is the kind of grassy field, but we don't see any green anymore. So we're not seeing the local color anymore. So we, as painters, we need to be very careful of not being fooled into thinking that we're seeing local color when we're not. So a big, common mistake when people are first learning to paint is to look at something like this, let's say the haystack, and think, well, the haystack's tan, so this color over here must be tan. And then you insist on mixing something like a tan on your palette because you know that the local color is tan. But you have to, in order to make successful illusionistic paintings, you have to start training your eye to see the color as it's actually existing in the situation we're looking at, and not the color that you think an object is based on your idea of what local color is. So that's going to be a really important thing we're going to be talking about. So, okay. So, and we'll talk much more in depth about color. So let's talk a little bit about what we might call the mechanics or the physics of light. So we're going to be using a very simple object to paint from today, just like this artist has done. This is a digital painting, not a very good one, but it's clear enough for us. So this artist is using a simple sphere. We're going to be using a simple cone, illuminated in the same way this artist has illuminated the sphere. And we can see in this painting, or in this digital image, a series of gradations of light as that light rolls over the form. And just so we start to have the same language, I want people to start trying to remember these terms. I'm not going to test you on it, but as an artist, and particularly if you're an artist who's going to be interested in this kind of making these kinds of paintings, you're going to want to start knowing these terms so that you're able to think about light with a certain kind of clarity, and also just communicate to other artists. So what happens to light when it rolls across a form? So again, as we talked about in those paintings, there we have a simple light mass and the shadow mass, right? So we have this kind of egg-like or oval shaped light mass, and then we have this crescent shaped shadow mass. And then if we start to analyze what happens within those larger masses, we can see here what's called the core shadow. So just as I pointed out in the previous images, the core shadow in this more complicated form, on a simple form, we see this more clear sense of the core shadow. So based on what we talked about in terms of reflected light, why is the core shadow darker? Why is that one of the darker parts of the form, of this main form? And it has to do, by the way, with the reflected light. So we see here the reflected light of the object. So why is this darker? We've sort of answered the question already, right? So this is the light mass, but I want people to really be looking at these objects we're working from and really asking these questions. So what accounts for these differences of light and shadow? These gradations of light and shadow, because I want you all to be as you're looking at objects and making paintings of them, I don't want you all to turn into kind of mechanical copiers. I want you to be really looking at the situation you're painting from, analyzing it, and then using what is most relevant for you as an artist to create as convincing an illusion as possible. So let's really ask ourselves, why is this thing that we call the core shadow, why is that darker than this area?
Because the light from the surface it's sitting on is reflecting back up to that point.
Right, that's exactly right. So the reflected light is reflecting up to this point here. But along this narrow plane, and this is actually a narrow curved plane, that plane is not receiving direct light, nor is it receiving reflected light. Or it's receiving much less reflected light than this part of the form, because this part of the form is turned towards this large reflecting surface. So that's neither receiving direct light or strong reflected light. So that's the darker part of the form shadow. So this is the form shadow. So the form shadow is the shadow on the form itself. So this is the darkest part of the form shadow. Here we have the reflected light we talked about. This is the cast shadow, right? So in lighting situations we're going to be working with, there's always going to be a cast shadow. So as opposed to the form shadow, the cast shadow is shadow on an object where light is being blocked by another form. So light mass, dark mass, core of the shadow, reflected light. This artist uses the term dark tone for dark mass. Some of these terms are, they're not absolute technical terms. They're just what we're dealing with, are commonly used terms. This edge, by the way, between the light and the shadow is often referred to as the terminator. That term, that comes from the word used to describe the point on the moon that goes from light to shadow. That point on the moon is called the terminator. So on all objects, we get a highlight, reflected light. This is often called the shadow accent, the very darkest part of a situation where there's virtually no light reaching. So that's called the shadow accent. That's what I typically call it, or a somewhat more technical term, the occlusion shadow. So we want to start thinking about these elements of light and shadow. And I'm going to be asking you to look for them and to include them in all of your paintings. And then finally, we get what's called the halftone. So this artist, this is wrong, actually. This artist points sort of vaguely to the light mass, or what's sometimes called the center light. That's really center light. Halftone is that subtle gradation of value that's neither dark nor light, and it just turns the edge from the dark into the light. I would say that's wrong. Okay. This is just an example of a student, a painting by a student at Queens College. This was done in the studio of a simple object. So you see, very similar to this digital rendering, this artist finding those elements: light, dark, reflected light, core of the shadow, halftone, cast shadow, occlusion shadow. This student, more successfully than this artist, noticed that as the planes of the sphere turn away from the reflecting surface, those planes on the sphere get less of the reflected light. So as that sphere turns up, again, away from the tabletop reflecting surface towards the ceiling, we see less reflected light. So the student did, I think, a strong job rendering this form. My guess is that there would have been a little bit more of a discernible core of the shadow here. That's okay. This is the painting that I do in the demonstration today. We're going to be doing a painting of a cone seen under a simple light source. Just by way of explanation, this is a fairly famous drawing by an artist named Pierre-Paul Prudhomme of a figure, again under a single light source. And then these are my pointing out the elements of light and shadow in a more complex form. So I'll post all these images, by the way. So we have this long irregular light shape, then this long irregular dark shape, very prominent reflected light areas. And then let's just compare this to the cone we're going to paint today. So light mass and dark mass. So we have the light mass and then the dark mass. We have this very clear core of the shadow. So you'll notice here there's the subtle core of the shadow as opposed to the reflected light. So reflected light. We have the cast shadow, cast shadow. There's occlusion shadows on this figure. So in creases on the skin where there's or creases in the body where there's almost no light getting to those areas. Those are shadow accents or occlusion shadows. We have this little occlusion shadow on the gap or in the gap between the cone and the tabletop. We have a highlight, highlights here, highlight here. You can't see it so clearly, but it's there. We have that very subtle highlight on the cone. We have the halftone. So we're going to be looking for all of those elements of light and shadow when we move on to our demonstration today. And actually, now I'm going to really drive this home, the elements of light and shadow. So I'm going to even go a little bit further today, because before I show the demonstration of me painting the cone from last semester, I'm actually going to show I'm going to show another short video which I will also post this on Blackboard. Where an artist talks about light and shadow. And I'm showing this now. I've mentioned all this. And by the way, for people interested, there are actually more and more useful videos about light and shadow online. Now this video, again, it repeats many of the things I've talked about, but it's a little bit goofy, which I find annoying. But he talks about light and shadow with a kind of clarity and using certain digital animation skills that I don't have. So that I think he offers a slightly different take on it, and a take on light and shadow that just adds to the clarity. So if this seems like I'm showing you something that just repeats what we've gone over, that's true, and I apologize. But I think it's useful because this is something we're all being introduced to for the first time. And so I want people to understand it as clearly as possible. By the way, these things that come up, this is actually a good video. Again, there's a lot of good information, I have to admit, online now. That's a great thing about the digital age we live in. That looks pretty good. I'll check that out later. Okay, so I am going to, let's start this video. I may stop it at
Valentine's is right around the corner. Surprise.
Welcome to Proco. My name is Stan Prokopenko. A lot of you have been asking for a video on shading. The first thing you need to understand when starting to shade is how light affects the appearance of form, and how to properly capture the three-dimensional form based on the characteristics of the light in the scene. In some of my previous videos, I talked about things like shapes, values, and edges. But how do we know what shapes, values, and edges to draw? What exactly are we looking for? Well, we're looking at light and how it illuminates the objects in our picture. Light is the reason we see anything, and the characteristics of the light can completely change the appearance of the objects it illuminates. So I like to analyze the light in the scene and try to capture it so the viewer can feel the light. Form looking three-dimensional is just a byproduct of correctly capturing the light on the form. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that studying light on form is important. Now let's take a look at all the elements. For this, I'm going to need an egg. For this, I'm going to need an egg. There are two main zones, light and shadow. The edge where the form transitions from light to shadow is the terminator. It's located at the tangent between the light source and the form. In other words, just before the planes start to face away from the light. Let's start by talking about the shadow side. There are two types of shadows. Form shadow is a shadow caused by the planes turning away from the light source. A cast shadow is caused by one form blocking the light from hitting another form. This egg is blocking the light from reaching this part of the table. You can find this shape by projecting lines from the light source to the terminator of the first form, and continuing those lines to the obstructed form. Shadows will rarely be completely black. Light bounces off objects in the environment and is reflected back into the shadows. This is called reflected light. In this case, the light will bounce off the paper and into the shadow on the egg. Along the terminator, sometimes you will see a core shadow. It's a darker plane that defines the edge of the shadow. The thickness and softness of the core shadow can vary quite a bit. It depends on the thickness of the form, how sharp the edge is between the planes of light and dark, or the angle and position of the reflecting light source. Sometimes you won't see the core shadow at all, only if there is something on the shadow side to reflect back enough light to create a visible difference in value. This dark piece of paper reflects less light than the white paper. you can see a drastic difference in the value of the reflected light. Also, regarding the visibility of a core shadow, the reflection has to come from the right angle. If it's directly behind the shadow side, it will create a nice core shadow. If we move the reflection source closer to the angle of the main light source, it will illuminate the area where the core shadow would have been. If you don't see a distinct core shadow, many artists choose to cheat one in because it can add to the three-dimensionality of the form.
I want to emphasize something he just said. I think is really important. So he said again, and I'm just going to go back. Let's just listen to what he said again about cheating in the core shadow. So he's pointing out that sometimes because of the color and value of reflected surfaces, you don't see much of a core shadow.
Cheat one in because,
but he says often artists will choose to cheat one in. And that's a really important idea because we as artists working from a set of objects that we're trying to paint, even when we're trying to paint them as convincingly, as realistically as possible, we don't have to just copy what's there. We can always interpret what's there so that our painting is as convincing an illusion of three-dimensional form as possible. And cheating in a cast shadow, cheating in a reflected light in a core shadow, when one isn't as strong as you might want it to be, is an important element of doing that. And so the reason some artists think that the illusion of form is stronger when there's a stronger reflected light, something like that, is because in this situation, what the way we read this light, that's actually not quite as, the way we read this is we read one plane facing one direction. Then we have the core of the shadow, which is a second plane, which is facing a different direction. And then the reflected light is now facing a third direction. And then with all these variations of value, we get even smaller turns in the form, each one of which faces a different direction. So that sequence of planes, each facing different directions, adds up to making the convincing illusion of three-dimensional volume, where if the light situation is such that the shadow plane just turns into an undifferentiated dark, that in effect turns into a flat shape. So even in situations like that,
also regarding the visibility of a core shadow,
the artist will
the
often
reflection has to come
reflect
from the
one.
right angle. If it's directly behind the shadow side, it will create a nice core shadow. If we move the reflection source closer to the angle of the main light source, it will illuminate the area where the core shadow would have been. If you don't see a distinct core shadow, many artists choose to cheat one in because it can add to the three-dimensionality of the form. Reflected light doesn't just affect form shadows, it also affects cast shadows. Less light can bounce into this deep crevice where the egg and table meet, and so that area gets darker as it goes deeper. This is called an occlusion shadow. Moving on to the light zone. Immediately after the terminator is the halftone. These are planes of the form that are partially hit by the direct light. As the planes get closer and closer to facing the light, they will get lighter. And the point where the form points directly at the light is called the center light. Don't confuse the center light with the highlight. The difference between the two is that the center light is the plane facing the light source, whereas the highlight is a reflection of the light source. A reflection will move depending on where the viewer is. So let's say this is the egg. The viewer or the camera is down here, and the light source is over here. The center light will be here facing the light source. The highlight, however, will need to be at the point where the light can bounce off the surface of the egg and reach the viewer's eyes. These two angles need to be equal. If you've played billiards, This is very similar. To test this concept, let's mark the point of the highlight. And mark another point for the center light. Now let's move the camera and see what happens. Okay, you can see here that the highlight moved to a different spot, following the camera. The center of light hasn't changed. It's still pointing directly at the light source. Don't let the math of all this confuse you. Highlights and cast shadows that we discussed earlier can be changed, and they'll still look believable. Nobody's going to call you on a highlight being in the wrong spot. I can take the highlight on this egg, move it to a different spot, and change the shape, and it still looks believable. I'll often change the shape of a cast shadow to better describe the form it's being cast onto. For example, if I have an object that casts a shadow appearing to go against the form of this paper towel roll is a cylinder. And to show that, I would change the cast shadow from the egg to wrap around the cylinder. I usually try to describe the form that the shadow is casting onto rather than the form casting the shadow. So give yourself artistic license. Learn the rules, and then learn how you can break the rules to improve your drawing. Just want to let you guys know, I'll be releasing a DVD very soon, so keep your eyes out.
Okay, so again, sorry for going over all that, but I think it's necessary. And I do think that he offers a very clear description of light and shadow, and he has that cool animation. So Nancy, you asked me a question at the beginning of class. What was it again? You reminded me of something I wanted. I think it was you, Nancy.
I don't remember asking anything in the beginning.
I felt like someone asked me a question and I said, yes, thank you for reminding me.
Was that the question about the homework?
No, what was the question about the homework?
Yeah, I think it was Tova. It was the question. It was about homework that you had to explain where we were going to put our homework.
Oh, yeah. Yes, thank you. Okay, let me do that before we move on to this. Okay, so this document will be up on Blackboard. So I'm going to ask people to, okay, so you can submit your homework on Blackboard. So that's where I'm going to be asking people to submit your assignments for grading. I will also ask you at times, and I will make this, you don't have to do this every time, but sometimes I may ask you to simply send me a JPEG of your homework, okay? So the question of like how to do that is important. So this is a document that will walk you through an easy way to photograph your paintings so that you can send them to me in such a way that I can see the paintings clearly, or as clearly as possible. This is a kind of do-it-yourself method. If anyone is a practiced photographer and has better means, that's totally fine. But this is just an easy way for anybody who is not necessarily a experienced photographer. But everybody should send me a clear image of your painting, and it should be square to the lens of the camera, okay? So this just walks through some stuff. So make sure your painting is well lit and evenly lit, or as evenly lit as possible. This is a good way to do it. You just place your painting down on a surface next to a window, or you could place it on a surface next to an open door that leads outside, just so that there's clear light raking across the painting. And then make sure that your painting is square to the frame of the camera lens. Okay, so notice that this painting has been placed on the floor, and then the artist has taken care to hold the camera lens so that the painting is not seen at an angle. It's completely square to the camera lens. So in other words, do not send me a photograph like this, because I can't see the painting, right? I can kind of see the painting, but I can much more prominently see whatever that stuff is in the background. The painting's at an angle, the light's hitting the texture of the painting in a funny way so that I don't really see these colors. So again, square your painting up, and then using the editing tools you have in your camera, which I'm guessing everybody has figured out. You can crop the image you take a photograph of. So don't send me your painting as a small image surrounded by floor, certainly not as an image surrounded by all of this visual noise. So use the editing tools in your camera to crop the image, okay? So that you, in the end, show me an image like this. That's the image you send me. Okay, I say in this that I recommend downloading a free app called Snapseed, which allows you a whole range of editing tools that I'm sure people can figure out. You don't have to do that. I mean, if you just want to use the editing tools in your camera, that's totally fine, or in your phone. People can ignore this because I came to realize that naming your image in this way is not so easy if you just have your phone to use. It should be, but it's actually not so easy. You can do it, but it's complicated. If it's possible for you to send me the image with your name clearly in the name of the image, like you can easily do that by saving an image in Photoshop or in, you know, if your computer has preview like I do, it comes with a Mac. If you can do that, if you can name the image that you sent to me with last name, first name, and then project name, that's ideal. If you can't do that, that's okay. So you want to take images of all the work you submit, and then you're going, for grading purposes, you'll want to submit that image on Blackboard, and that will be in the grading section. And then there are certain classes where I'm going to ask you to just send me a JPEG of the image by email. So does that answer the question? Is that, Tova, is that clear?
Yeah, it's clear. I didn't hear, did you say that we have to do the homework on a canvas?
It should be on Canvas. It should be on the Canvas boards I asked you to buy.
Okay, and those are, what size are those again?
I think I asked you to buy 11 by 14.
Okay, perfect.
I mean, why do you ask? I mean, were you going to ask about doing it on a different surface?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, yeah, I didn't know which one we had to do that.
I mean, you could do these homework. You could do them on the Canvas pad. That will work. You know, for these in-class, what we call, or what I call in-class paintings, it'd be a little better to do them on the Canvas board. You know, you could do things like gesso. I don't ask you to buy gesso though. We don't get into that. You could do it on paper if you treat the paper the right way. But I don't know, that's getting complicated, and you're not really going to save any money because these Canvas panels are cheap. So yeah, the easiest thing is just use these default Canvas panels.
Okay, no problem.
Okay. So this is this is a demo and just a description of setting up your work area that I did again in the second class fall semester. So I'm obviously not in my studio. I'm obviously not doing this demo right now. I'm going to be here the whole time this is going, and I may stop at a few points to further explain anything that I don't feel is thoroughly explained. I will say, this will be up on YouTube. I mean, it is up on YouTube, but it'll also be on Blackboard. So if anyone wants to, I suppose there's no reason you have to stay in class at this point. If anyone wants to cut away now, you could do that. You are certain, in order to do well on this assignment, you are going to need to watch this video for sure. So you're going to need to watch it. So you want to make sure to do that at some point. And if you choose to watch this on your own, I won't be available to answer any questions. You can certainly, as this video is going, ask any questions. But again, if people want to stop watching at this point and watch later, that's fine. Okay. So I'm just going to get it started. Part of the technical difficulties today was figuring out, close my window as long as it's possible, trying to figure out how to make this camera work. This is not an ideal camera because the canvas I'm working on is not bent. So I'm going to have to get some kind of better camera, but this will do for today. Okay, so first I'm going to turn here.
Professor, we can't hear the sound for the video.
Sorry, I muted myself so you couldn't hear me talking or any noise. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm gonna have to go back. I apologize for that. Please be sure to let me know if anything like that happens.
We were writing it in the chat box.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Figuring out. You can hear now, right?
Yeah, I can hear it.
Possible. Trying to figure out how to make this camera work. This is not an ideal camera because the canvas I'm working on is not bent. So I'm going to have to get some kind of better camera, but this will do for today. Okay, so first I'm going to turn it here. So this is my painting table. I obviously have a different relationship to painting than most of you do, so I'm not expecting people to have this kind of setup. This is, I have a glass palette. So this palette here, take all this stuff off. That's the surface I mix my paint on. I think probably most people bought the disposable palettes. So every day I have to clean that off. If you have those disposable palettes, you can just rip off that sheet and throw it away. But if anyone did find an alternative, in other words, a different kind of surface to mix on, let me just ask, did everyone buy the disposable palettes, or is anybody using something different?
I have an older, like, wooden palette.
You have a wooden palette, okay, that's fine. Okay. So, and do you have experience using it?
Yes.
Okay. So I asked everybody to get 3 jars, 3 containers, so something like this. So any of these kinds of things would work perfectly well if you could use old food containers. If you bought them, that's fine too. So the reason I want people to have 3 containers is in order to use your mineral spirits in a way that is most useful and I think helps you save money most easily. So you're going to use one of these containers to put your mineral spirits in. So let's just say you use this. Use this. So let's just say you use this one. So when you're setting up your workstation, you'll pour out some mineral spirits. Don't be stingy on your mineral spirits. You want to use, maybe that's a little bit too much, but you want to use something like that. So that's what you're going to clean your brushes. Okay. So I have this old jar that I've been using for years with my mineral spirits in it. And I painted yesterday. I stopped painting late last night, and I put the lid back on this. And overnight, what has happened, and this happens with mineral spirits. So let's just say that's your. So here's your clean mineral spirits, and you spend all day cleaning your brush with mineral spirits. So your mineral spirits gets progressively dirty. So by the end of the day, that's going to be dirty and sludgy, right? And so at the end of yesterday, when I finished painting, the mineral spirits in here were dirty and sludgy. So they start to become a little bit muddy the more paint you clean off of them. But you don't want to throw that paint, you don't want to throw that mineral spirits away. So what happens with mineral spirits is you leave it overnight, or you leave it, depending on when you come back to paint, maybe the next day, or the next week, whatever. And what's going to have happened is all of that paint that you've cleaned off in the mineral spirits, all of those particles of paint are going to have settled to the bottom and created a kind of muddy sludge at the bottom of your mineral spirits. And your mineral spirits, so most of the mineral spirits in here will be clear. So these mineral spirits yesterday were all dirty and sludgy, but the sludge has settled to the bottom. And so I'm going to take my second jar, so jar number 2, the 3 I asked you to add. And I'm going to pour out the clean mineral spirits into that jar. So the reason you want to do that is, so the mineral spirits are a little bit stained, but that's totally usable mineral spirits. And then there's a little bit of mineral spirits left in here, and there's a little bit of sludge. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mix up that little bit of remainder. And I'm going to dump all of that into this sludge jar. And I'll let that sludge build up until this jar is filled, and then I'll just throw that away. So you're allowed to do that in New York City. In a lot of cities, you have to bring that to hazardous waste, but in New York City, you can just dump that in the trash. So I now have my empty mineral spirits jar, and I have my transfer jar of clean mineral spirits. So I'm just going to pour that back into my mineral spirits jar, and I'm going to use that clean mineral spirits. So that's perfectly good mineral spirits. You don't need to throw that away and waste that money. You can keep using that mineral spirits over and over again. So this gallon of mineral spirits will last me like a year. I'll top that off a little bit. So I'm going to have this for the next year. So don't waste money by tossing your mineral spirits. I mean, for one thing, you can't throw mineral spirits away down the sink. Of course, you're not going to get caught, but you're not supposed to do that. It's bad for the water supply. It's environmentally bad. And you don't need to do that. You can keep using that mineral spirits. One thing about disposal of mineral spirits, if for whatever reason you have to, the way you're supposed to get rid of mineral spirits is with your regular garbage. So you're supposed to, according to the Department of Sanitation, pour your mineral spirits into something that is absorbent. So like rags or newspapers, or the best thing is kitty litter, if you want to go that far. And then just throw it out in the regular trash. But you don't, I really want to emphasize, especially people working at home, you don't want to throw mineral spirits down the sink. It should always be disposed of in the trash. So whether we're talking about this sludge, or if for whatever reason you have to throw away mineral spirits, but you shouldn't have to. So really try to have those three containers. One container for your mineral spirits that you use to clean your brushes, a transfer jar, and then a sludge jar where you can dump the sludge. You'll put that away in, if you have a box, put it in a closet. Just keep it somewhere out of the way during the class. Does that make sense to everybody? Can I explain that a little further?
No, that was perfect.
So if anybody, I'm sorry, did someone want me to explain that further? So if anyone needs me to clarify at any point, just let me know. All right. So tomorrow, so I cleaned off black paint here. Tomorrow, all that black paint is going to be at the bottom, and this will be clear mineral spirits. Okay, so I have my palette. I have my palette knife, my old palette knife. I like these industrial paper towels, but regular paper towels are totally fine. So I like to have paper towels, toilet.
I have a question.
And then,
Go ahead.
Cloth.
How many times can we reuse the mineral spirits?
Over and over again.
Okay.
It doesn't lose its strength.
Okay.
So the only thing, as you dump out the clean stuff and get rid of the sludge, that the amount of mineral spirits will get a little bit smaller and smaller. So you're probably just going to keep topping it off. So it goes on forever. You don't have to get rid of that.
Okay, thank you.
And it sometimes will be slightly stained, like some colors stain mineral spirits more than others. Like there's a certain blue. And so it might actually be sometimes the mineral spirits might look a little bit like you put a drop of food color in it or something. That's totally fine. That doesn't diminish its strength.
Rags. So old t-shirts. I highly recommend having these. So this is a rag I've used for a few weeks. So those are extremely useful in cleaning up and the process of cleaning your brushes and so on as you're painting. So, that's part of this t-shirt that I'm progressively cutting. So again, to get rags, like old t-shirts are great, but you can also, again, get a bag of rags at a hardware store or something like that. So you want to try to have all these things. You get paper towels. I like having toilet paper, but to do things like when I use my palette knife, just to clean, I just take a little piece of toilet paper and wipe it off instead of making the rag get progressively dirty. I have a paper bag or a plastic bag. I pin it to the side to my table where I throw all my painting trash. So painting trash, I would recommend, if you can, throw that away. Have a container for your painting trash and throw it away at the end of your painting session outside. So if it's possible to throw it away in a outside garbage bin, that's best. I mean, it's extremely unlikely that this would be any kind of a fire hazard because odorless mineral spirits, and especially Gansol, are not very flammable. Again, they're much less flammable than, for example, nail polish remover. But I think it's a good idea to try to dispose of that in an outside container. And if you have to throw it away in an inside container, I would just take the bag at the end of your painting session and saturate the rags and paper towels in there with water and then throw it away. And it's perfectly safe. Okay, so again, you have your container with mineral spirits. You want to have a generous amount of mineral spirits, paper towels, rags. Hopefully people have their brushes. And then we have, today we're going to be using just black and white. So the first painting we do.
I just want to say, when I did this demonstration, I used black and white. I asked people to buy a color called Payne's Gray. And when you look at Payne's Gray out of the tube, it looks like black, but it's black with, it's a bluish black. So there's a little bit more blue in it than typical black. So if you have Payne's Gray and white, use Payne's Gray for this painting. If you only have black, that's fine too. But I preferably for this painting, use white and Payne's Gray.
It's going to be just using white and black. So, so the next thing, so then we have, so this is my setup, okay? So this is the setup I'm going to be working from. So because of this camera, that light gets blasted out. But I've set up this, the simple cone in a box. And the reason I strongly recommend people get a box to set up these still lives is you want to have a situation where you can really just have a single light source. So I have my clip-on lamp illuminating the simple form on the left-hand side. And then the box is blocking out any light that may be coming from other parts of the room. Okay? Just the best way to do this kind of still life, especially when you're working in a home situation. And I hope I sent everybody a decent image of that cone. I sent everybody a photograph of that cone. that hopefully you can refer to as I'm doing the painting. Because I'm not going to be able to have my camera on both the painting I'm doing and the still life. Okay, so refer to that image. That the image that I sent you today of just the cone is a photograph of the cone that I'm working from here.
Professor, I have a silly question.
Yep.
Are we going to be having breaks during this class?
Yeah, we have a break in the middle of class.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
So this camera is not the best, but it'll do for today. All right, so I showed everybody my palette that I typically use. When I do these demos, I like to use this palette, upright palette, so you can see what I'm mixing as I'm mixing. So we're going to be using black, white, and we're going to be doing a painting of this very simple object. So in this class, we start the semester with very simple objects, very simple geometric forms that very clearly reveal those basic elements of painting that we're studying. And then we move from there to more complex objects and more complex elements in the painting. So we start adding color, we start adding texture, and we slowly work towards more complex paintings. Okay, so I'm going to draw the painting with a brush about that size. Okay, start the drawing. I notice that people often want to start a drawing with a brush something like this size. You want to find a brush that they think approximates a pencil, but don't do that. Don't use a small pointed brush to do your drawing. It's not advantageous when making a painting. I'll show you why. It's much better to use the type of brush that I asked you to get, either a filbert or a flat. It's much better to use one of these brushes. And you can use it as a kind of chisel to do your drawing. So I'll show you what I mean. So so the first thing, again, hopefully people can refer to the photo I sent today. So just to clarify, I also sent you all that same photo, both of those photos actually, a photo of the setup and then a photo zoomed into the cone I'm working from in this demonstration. So everybody should have that, and hopefully you can pull that up just to see what I'm working from, so you can see them both. I don't yet have the skills to do that to edit in that little inset of what I'm working from. Someday I'll figure that out.
But for now, I did send that photo this morning.
So the first thing we need to do, obviously, is draw our scope, right? We could just start painting without drawing, but I'm not going to. So I'm going to do something. So I want to talk a little bit about drawing. So often in painting classes, not everybody has had drawing as a prerequisite. Ideally, I would like to have everybody have taken drawing, but that's not always the case. So I'm going to start the painting today by talking about some basic fundamental drawing issues. So I'm doing this painting on a board very similar to the ones you bought. I'm going to take my black paint and I'm going to draw that cube, that cone. I'm going to draw the cone and the space it's sitting in. But I'm not going to draw that cone just by sort of arbitrarily eyeballing the contour. So I'm not going to do something like this. I'm instead going to look for what's often referred to as the underlying structure of what I'm drawing. So what that is you're looking for certain underlying elements or kind of architectural structure that will help you draw that object, whatever it may be, in this case it's a relatively simple object, as accurately as possible. So in the case of this cone, the first thing I'm going to look for is a center line. And the reason I'm going to find that is because a cone, in order to draw that cone convincingly, I'm going to want that cone to appear to be absolutely vertical. Right? That's a principle of a cone. Right? A cone is a vertical form. Right? It's not leaning to one side or the other. So in order to help me establish that very easily, I'm going to draw a second. And then if I talk about the ellipse on the cone, does anyone know what I'm referring to? What is the ellipse on the cone? Anyone define what an ellipse is?
It's like the way that the circular part is seen by the viewer.
I'm sorry, say it again.
It's the circular part of the cone.
Right. It's the an ellipse in drawing or painting is a circle seen in perspective. So it's a circle seen at an oblique angle to the viewer's plane of vision. So this is the cone I'm working from. We know that if we were to look at the bottom of the cone would be a circle shape. An ellipse is a circle that the viewer sees turned away from the plane of vision. So as we turn that circle shape at a more and more oblique angle away from the viewer's plane of vision, that circle becomes more and more distorted. We no longer see it as a circle. Instead we see it as what we refer to as an ellipse. So after setting up the simple center line for the cone, I'm going to establish where my ellipse is going to be. And in perspective drawing, an ellipse is always drawn on a horizontal. So in order to draw this cone so that I have an accurate sense of its verticality and an accurate sense of an accurate shape for that ellipse, I'm going to do a center line and then a horizontal. And that horizontal is going to help me place that ellipse. So I'm going to start the drawing of the cone. So I'm looking really carefully at that circle that is turned away from me. And I'm asking myself how how wide it is compared to how wide it is compared to how high it is. How open is that circle? Like how much is it distorted away from the shape of the circle? So I think I'm seeing an ellipse that has curves, something like that. And before I go any further, I know that one side of a cone is going to be bilaterally symmetrical with the other side. In other words, one side of the cone is going to be exactly the same shape and mirror image as the other side. So I'm going to make sure one half of the cone is equal in width to the other half. And then I'm just going to determine the height of the cone. Make those lines connecting. So I can start that cone with a fairly accurate drawing. Now, a cone, the horizontal axis of an ellipse, again, should always be absolutely horizontal. So the axis of an ellipse, the long axis of an ellipse will never tilt one way or the other in our plane of vision. So this long axis of the ellipse should be absolutely horizontal. So I'm going to check that. It's pretty much horizontal. My drawing a little. So I have a decent, I think, a decent start for my cone. You always want to look for that, for what that helpful underlying structure is in whatever you're drawing. We'll talk about that more extensively for the more complex objects again. Okay, so the next thing, so I'm not just drawing a cone in an empty space. It's a cone that's sitting on the bottom plane of a box, and I can see the back plane of the box behind it. And we call that the back wall. So I want to draw the division between the plane of the surface that the cone is resting on and the wall behind it. So where does that division between surface and wall, how does that relate to the cone? So I'm going to look at whether that division happens halfway up. Does it happen higher than halfway? Does it happen lower than halfway? It happens just a little bit lower than halfway. So the division between the division between the surface that the cone is resting on and the wall intersects with the cone just a little bit below halfway. Draw that out. Again, I'm very carefully looking at, I'm trying to get proportions accurate. I'm trying to get the relationship between objects accurate. So now in this very simple setup, I have a very simple drawing of the objects I'm making. So, okay, so I have my contour drawing of the cone. I still have those underlying structural lines underneath. Those don't matter, they can stay. I have a simple blocking of the space that cone is in. So I have the division between the surface the cone is resting on and the wall. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look carefully at the light and shadow. So what exactly is happening with the light and shadow? So I want to find where on this form the light transitions from the light mass into the shadow mass. And I'm going to draw out that transition. So that's going to be part of my drawing. So take my paint. And I'm thinning the paint a little bit with some mineral spirits to make it a little bit more liquidy. Certainly do that. So if you look at the image I sent, the photograph of what I'm working from, I think you'll see that there's a division between light and shadow that's about 1/4 of the way over. So the cone divides from light to shadow just about here. Let me get rid of clean up the drawing.
Professor,
Professor,
Yeah.
would
you're
you
cleaning it with the mineral spirit?
would you suggest that we sketch everything out in like pencil first, or should we attempt to sketch it in like paint?
It's really up to you. Technically, or at least you'll find some artists saying that you shouldn't use graphite pencil to draw a painting, or to start the drawing for a painting, because graphite pencil is greasy and it actually will potentially cause problems for how well the paint will adhere to the surface. But but I assume people wouldn't be putting down that much graphite. So if you really want to draw it with a pencil, you can. I don't see any reason to do that. And I think it's a good idea to develop the confidence to do it with paint. But if anybody wants to draw it out with a pencil, that's fine. That's really a personal preference.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm thinning it with mineral spirits, yeah.
Okay.
And cleaning it up with mineral spirits, with a rag dipped in mineral spirits. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
And so, okay, so I have my cone and then the division of light and shadow right around here. It's about the right-hand corner of the cone falls into shadow, right? So all of this side of the cone is in shadow. And that's happening because our light is coming from, as people know from the setup, the light is coming from approximately this direction. Light's coming from the left, and hitting the left-hand side of the cone. And then as that cone rolls away from the light source, it moves into shadow. Now, there's not only the shadow mass on the right-hand side of the cone. We often refer to that as form shadow. So the shadow that's on the form itself. So I also want to draw in the cast shadow. So the cast shadow always starts at the same point that the shadow starts on the form. So the cast shadow starts at that same point, and and moves backward along the surface of the table like this. So we have a cast shadow here, something like that. So we've got our cone, and we've indicated the light mass and the dark mass and the cast shadow. So now before I go any further, I want to introduce a measuring technique that's going to help me figure out if the proportions on my cone are accurate. So when I say the proportions on my cone, what do I mean by that? If I'm trying to find accurate proportions, what do I mean? Does anyone know what that? When we're talking about drawing objects, what does proportion refer to?
You don't want it to be narrower or wider than what you see in real life. You want the measurements to be fairly accurate.
Right. So this is, of course, that's not necessarily true in all paintings, right? There are many artists who are not that interested in that. But if we're using this as an opportunity to train ourselves to be able to see accurate, to be able to accurately represent what we're looking at, we want to try to get accurate proportions. So I want to make my cone, I want to make the height of my cone accurate to the width. And I don't want the drawing of my cone to be long and skinny if my cone that I'm looking at is relatively squat and wide, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my brush, and I'm going to take the width of the cone. So I'm going to be actually doing it up on my still life. So I'm going to be doing this. I'm going to be holding my brush up in front of the cone, and I'm going to be taking that width like this. And then I'm going to turn that width and see how many times that width fits into the height. So it fits in once. So the cone is about 1.5 times the width, right? So I'm going to do the same thing to the cone. So I'm going to see if my cone is accurate. So 1, 1. My cone could be a little bit shorter. So I'm going to take off just a little bit of height on my cone. And of course, this painting isn't going to be any better or any worse if the proportion of the cone is a little bit off. But I think it's well worth training yourself to be able to see accurate proportions, because then you can manipulate those proportions all you want. But you're not manipulating the proportions by mistake. You're manipulating proportions when you do it intentionally. And you know, some people find it much harder to draw or paint in a way where you achieve a kind of absolute accuracy of proportions. And that's fine. That doesn't mean you're not going to be terrific artists. But I think it's well worth trying to develop the ability to see proportions as accurately as possible. So now we have a good working drawing to get started. This line here is a little bit arced, but I'm going to change that when I block in the values around. I'm not going to do that in the drawing right now. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing is I have a very subtly colored still life, right? I have a pale yellow cone. I have a gray background. I have a brown surface that the cone is resting on. But we don't have colors today, right? We have black and white.
So I'm just going to be looking for one, accurate proportion, as we just did. I'm going to be looking for the elements of light and shadow. And I'm going to be looking for accurate value relationships. So that's incredibly important. In a way, I'm not going to be painting a cone today. I'm instead going to think about this as painting value relationships. So painting values of lighter areas of color as opposed to areas of darker color or darker value, excuse me. It's a way of thinking about paintings we make. I think it's really important. So I'm going to start this painting as I always start my paintings by blocking in the background first. And the reason I do that is, and I want people to do that in your paintings. When this class meets in person, I insist on it. I obviously can't insist on it in this situation, but I like people to try to do this. And I'll talk about why in a minute. So I'm going to block in the background before I start working with the phone. So I have here a value scale. This is a kind of conventional value scale. It's a strip of values that go from white to black. And there are 7 divisions of value in between. So as I look at my still life, I'm going to be asking myself, what is the value of those different areas of the still life I'm looking at? So what I mean by that is, let's say I'm looking at the background in that still life. So again, if you refer to that photograph I sent you, and I'm going to be asking myself, what is the value of that? Is that a very dark gray? Is it a very light gray? Is it a middle gray? Is it approximately this value, this value? And I'm going to be making my decision about what value I'm going to set based on that. So looking at that background, I see a kind of a middle gray, but a middle gray that's sort of slightly on the light side of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a relatively big brush, and I'm going to mix up a value that I think is about the right value for that background. I'll try that value. As I mix it on the palette, that looks like it's about the right value. And I'm just going to block in. I'm not going to get fussy about this. I'm just going to block in very, very broadly one big tone for that background. So what I mean by that, I'm not going to be looking at any details or any small differences. You know, if there's a wrinkle on that piece of paper on the background wall or anything like that. I'm just going to be looking for a very big, simplified value of that background. And I think it's a value something like this. Now, as I'm putting this value down, people may be looking at that value and thinking to yourself, that looks awfully dark. Does anybody think that looks maybe too dark for the value in the background? Again, if you're able, hopefully you're able to refer to that photo I sent. So sometimes when you put down the initial value mass, it's going to look darker than it actually is. And that's because, anyone know why? Like, this looks darker now than it will ultimately look when I get the whole painting blocked in. Anybody know why that is?
It'll be in comparison to the more like extreme light on the cone.
Well, it looks dark now because it's in comparison to all the white around. Right? When all of these areas have other values, this is not going to appear quite as dark. But you're right, it will appear dark compared to the extreme white here. So I'm putting down very, very large masses of value. So this is a kind of rule, not a rule, that's a long word. I think a good bit of advice is to always work from the very large masses, the very large simple masses, and progressively get down to the smaller nuances, right? The smaller details. You don't want to try to chain up a whole bunch of little incidents and create the large mass. You want to go from the large masses to the smaller. So again, just meaning that I'm just blocking in a big, simple tone of that map. So now I'm going to block in. I may need to make that a little bit lighter, but we'll see. Now I'm going to block in a value for the surface that the cone is sitting on. So what's the value difference between the background and between the back wall and the surface that the cone is sitting on? What's a lighter and what's a darker value? Like is the surface of the table darker or lighter than the cone? Looking at the image I sent people.
It's lighter?
The surface of the table, is it darker or lighter than the background?
Darker. It's darker.
Right. So it's actually considerably dark. Right? So I'm going to mixing up a large mass of gray. Mix up a darker value. Looks like the same value. It's darker. So as I'm blocking, I want to move, when I put the paint down, I want to move the brush in an active way. I don't want to imitate the painting of a house. I don't want to just do this. The reason I don't want to do that is I don't want to be putting the paint down in a way that reinforces the flatness of that surface. So remember, we're trying to make a painting where we convince the viewer that this flat surface is not a flat surface at all. We want to convince the viewer that this flat surface is actually a space that opens up beyond the plane of the painting. So part of the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to put the paint down in an active way. So I'm going to be moving my brush in a way that recreates the movement along the surface, back towards the wall. I can use a variety of strokes, but I want to put the paint down so that there's no way the paint's application is going to reinforce that flat surface. I want everything I do making this painting, I want to do in such a way that I am working to in a way, eliminate the flat plane of the canvas and create a believable space that cone is sitting. So also notice that I'm not being precious about the contour lines of the cone I drew, because I can always get those back. And I want to make sure that I'm blocking in my paint right back up to the edge of the contour line of the cone that I've drawn. I don't want to leave a little space of blank canvas between the cone and the background. Sometimes I'll see people do that. People, I think, get hesitant about destroying their drawings. So they leave a little space of canvas. You don't want to do that. You want to very assertively block in the background right up to the surface of the drawing. But if you mess up your contour line a little bit, you always get that back. So a very simple, value for the plane of the back wall and the plane of the surface that cone is sitting on. Now, notice I've left this cast shadow blank. That's really important. You always want to paint shadow and light areas as separate areas of paint. You don't want to try to put down the light over the whole thing and then paint the shadow back into that light. Because what will happen if I try to paint a darker value into wet paint, the wet paint lightens the value, so I can't really get it as dark as I want. So you want to make sure to paint lights and shadows always as separate elements. So now I'm going to ask myself, what's the value of that cast shadow compared to the value of the light parts of the tabletop surface? So that's a darker value still. Use a slightly smaller brush. And I'm going to block in, again, very simply. I'm going to block in that cast shadow. So remember, we're looking for those elements of light and shadow. So light mass, dark mass, form shadow, and here cast shadow. So now, okay, so I have a very simple statement, a very simple block-in of that cast shadow. What's not quite right about the cast shadow as I've painted it? Like what characterizes a cast shadow? What do you, looking at image of the still life I'm working from, what am I not seeing about the cast shadow? So I'm blocking it very simply. I'm blocking that very simple shadow shape. What's it missing? What's not quite right about this edge, the division between the cast shadow and the light side of the
Looking at the image, it looks like the shadow is also on the light side a little bit.
You mean, okay, so you mean as the tabletop goes backwards, it gets a little bit darker back here?
No, like on the right side, it looks like there's a little shadow that goes onto the light part.
Oh, back here.
Yeah.
Oh, that's true.
In like that corner.
There's a kind of, that's very subtle, so I'm not going to put that in right now.
Okay.
You're right. I mean, you could start to indicate those. Those are subtleties. Normally, I wouldn't put that in, but you're right. It gets a little bit darker here. And we can start to indicate that. I'm going to be very, I'm going to really be subtle on that. I don't want to overstate that. We start to get a little bit of darkness here. And we actually, now that you've mentioned that, the tabletop is lighter here than it is here. Do you see that? And that's also something, we can do that. Normally I wouldn't, I don't think I would do that at this point, but we could start to indicate that. So I can take some light and lighten this part of the, so I don't want to overstate that at all. I don't want to make too dramatic a difference because it's actually pretty subtle. So it does get slightly darker as the tabletop goes back. And I can start to indicate that. And that's actually helpful. Because that's going to help us make the cast shadow be a little bit more strong. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to it's called feathering out. So I've made this a little bit lighter, and I'm going to let that soften into the darker part of it back here. So I'm going to feather that in. So what I'm doing is I'm barely touching the surface of the paint, just like scrubbing those different values together. I can start indicating that. That's helpful. What do you, like, if we look at the edge between this shadow and the light part of the table, what's different in the image you're looking at?
There's like a second lighter shadow behind the other darker shadow.
It's not a second shadow exactly. It's kind of half-tone as that shadow, because the division between the cast shadow and the light isn't completely, isn't a sharp transition. And you want to notice that. So you want to notice those halftones. So there's a softness to this edge. So I'm seeing the division between light and shadow. I also want to notice that softness of this edge. So it isn't a sharp edge. So in order to give those transitions or that sense of light and shadow a believability, you want to indicate the light and shadow with the clarity that it has. So there's an absolute clarity between the lights and the shadows, but at the same time, you want to indicate the softness of those shadow edges, so that we believe those transitions. It's kind of softness in that shadow. I want the shadow to read clearly, but I also want to have that softness in this thing.
Professor, what is the stick tool that you're using?
Yeah. So this is called this is common for artists to use. So what you do is so that you're not touching your painting, but you have some control of it. You rest it on your easel, or you can rest on top of your painting, and then you just rest your hand on the stick. So this is called a mahl stick, M-A-H-L. And you can buy them in an art supply store. They cost about $25. Once you buy it in an art supply store, usually come in 3 segments, so you can take them apart and carry them with you easily. This is just a dowel that I bought in the hardware store. But it's just like a wooden dowel like this.
hardware store, you can go in and get these dowels, and this probably costs $2 or $3. This is one that I've used for years, so it has like paint on it and stuff. But I always paint with them, so I don't ask people to buy them, but they're very useful. Soften that edge.
Thanks.
I'm going to take a soft brush, and I'm going to use that soft brush to just blend this together. So I can give people suggestions for something like this as a blending tool for anybody who's interested in it. In this semester's supply list, I included a brush that can be used to do what I'm doing there for anyone who's interested. It's the Sumi brush. So the reason I included that in this year's supply list, again, was so people can use it as a blender, as I'm doing there with that soft watercolor brush. So I would recommend not using it to put down the paint. And a Sumi brush is made for watercolor, so it's not really good to use with oil paint. But I would use it for this kind of thing, for anyone who's interested in blending. And if, as I say in this video, if there are other kinds of brushes that are useful for blending too. So if anybody's interested in that, I can go over those recommendations. But the Sumi brush is intended for this. Yeah, I don't require that people buy them because not everybody's necessarily interested in that kind of painting, and I want to keep the costs down. But for anybody who's interested in this, I'll send people a link, a couple suggestions for useful brushes to blend with. So just on that topic, useful blending brushes are things like this. Again, for anybody who wants to invest in them. So these ones here, those are called fan brushes. And then these ones here are actually watercolor brushes, but they look a little bit like makeup brushes. These are all very useful for blending. So if anybody wants any information on that, I'll send some links. You can also get these kinds of brushes for that.
Professor, I had a question. So how long does it take for the paint to dry? Like how long do we have to work with it?
It'll take a day or two.
Okay.
So if I wanted to start like knitting that back, or I could start just with this fan brush. Just start to do that. You don't want to overdo it at the beginning. So you don't want to over smooth things. Okay, so now we have a decent, I think, block-in of the background and the cast shadow. I'm going to do a couple of small sort of details to start to give the painting a little bit of, we'll start to move it away from that simple. So there's a little cast shadow on a piece of paper. So I'll put that in. So it's the paper. Just to clarify that division. Okay, so I have the background with the cast shadow blocked in. So now I'm going to look at, remember, we're looking at lights and shadows
And I'm going to look at the value of the dark side of the cone. Actually, why don't we take a 10-minute break? People asked about a break. Usually I take a 15 or 20-minute break, but since we started late today, let's just do a 10-minute break. I'm gonna start painting again at exactly 4:40, okay? So we'll just break for a few minutes, okay? Why don't we also take a short break? Class is going, yeah, why don't we also take a 10-minute break? I'll forward the video and then we will start at 44. Yeah, it's what's that late? My God. Wait a minute. No. It's 12:44. Yeah, let's take a 10-minute break and we'll start again. Let's see. We'll start again at 12:58. Okay.
What time did I say we'd get started again? Anyone remember?
I think you said 58.
Oh, I did. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. So let's get going. I'm going to move on, as I said before the break, to blocking in the overall simple average value. So if you look at the object in the image I sent you, you can see that there's more than just one value shadow side. There are multiple values in it. But again, I'm going to try to build this painting from very simple masses to the more complex. So I'm going to look at that shadow mass, and I'm just going to assign it kind of overall average value. So actually, I don't know, I'm not sure if you can see this in the image I sent. Actually, let me see. I'm just looking at the image I sent you. Yeah, okay, so look at the image I sent you. Do you notice how the value of the shadow is pretty much exactly the same value as the table behind the cone right here? So this value and this value are about the same. So I'm going to use that value, that same value I mixed up for tabletop, make the shadow value. So again, I'm just going to block that in very, very hard. So I'm just finding one simple value for that shadow side. And remember, it's about the value of the shadow side of the cone is about the same value as the tabletop just behind. So I'm just blocking this all in. Initially, one very simple value.
One of the students is locked outside.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think that's about the right value for the shadow side of the object. Now I'm going to, before I get into the lights, I'm just going to clarify one thing. So remember when we were talking about the elements of light and shadow, we talked about the form shadow, the shadow on the form itself. We talked about the cast shadow. And then we talked about something that we call either the shadow accent or the occlusion shadow. So those are the very darkest shadows where almost no light is getting. So there's no direct light, there's no reflected light. And so there's not a lot of occlusion shadow in the setup.
there is an occlusion shadow actually right underneath the cone, a kind of dark line just underneath the cone. There's almost no light in it. And then there's a subtle occlusion shadow where contour of the cone meets the cast shadow. So it's just a kind of darker area of shadow. Just to the right of cone where it meets the cast shadow. Just want to put that in. Again, give a little more complexity and subtlety. Now I want to block in an equally simple large mass from the light side of that cone. So the light side of that cone is very light. So I'm going to mix up a value. So that cone is nearly white, but it's not quite white. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put down some pure white where the highlight is. And I'm going to use that to gauge the value of the cone, the light mass of the cone. So the light mass of the cone should be nearly white, but not quite white. So, and again, I'm not looking at any subtlety. I'm not looking at little details. If there's a little wrinkle in the paper surface of the cone, I'm not going to bother with that here. I'm just looking at big light and dark masses, big light and dark values. So I think that value of the light side of the cone is about something like that. And I think that in very broadly. Very simple, large mass. Again, ignoring any details. The details are not important here, not important right now. I just want to establish a big, convincing series of relationships between the values that I see up in the center. Very simple masses of lights and shadows. So what? Okay, so now we have everything masked. We have all of our lights and darks. Now what? So we have a good start, a good big statement of the large light and dark value relationships. What seems to be lacking, though? Can anyone, like looking at the image and then looking at our painting, what seems to be lacking? Like what's something that we could start adding to this painting? Give it more subtlety, give it more believability.
Could it be the cast shadow?
I'm sorry?
Could it be the cast shadow?
Well, this is the cast shadow, right? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Well, the cast shadow, I'm going to leave that for now. I want to work on some other things. Like, what else does the painting need?
Maybe a little bit more light.
A little bit more light. You mean a little bit more complexity in the light or more variety in the light?
Maybe. I meant like to the corner, like bottom left, maybe.
Yeah, well, I do think there needs more information in the light. I think actually in the painting in general, we just need to find more information. We have a very simple line here. I think a very useful line. But it's also very simple. It's a little bit flat, a little bit oversimplified. Does anyone remember what are the elements of light and shadow that we talked about? Does anyone remember any of those elements of light and shadow that we can start to look for and find?
You could add like halftones.
Halftone. Right, so that's the first thing I would look for.
Yeah, I want to just emphasize here at this point in the demo. So this is an important point to get to in any painting where you've blocked in where you've blocked in the big statement of light and dark masses. But so now at this point in the painting, you want to start looking for all of those elements of light and shadow that we talked about earlier today. Now, I'm not saying everyone should have remembered all those terms, but we want to start now finding core of the shadow, reflected light, halftones, highlight. So that's an important, now those details are important to start concentrating on at this point.
So the division between the dark and the light is a little bit abrupt, isn't it? It's a little bit too sharp. You think that's true? So I'm going to look for the halftone. So I want to bring in a halftone that's going to make that form roll around in space in a little bit more of a subtle, a little bit more of a convincing way. So I'm going to mix up a value that's between the dark and the light. So what's that value? It's going to be about a middle gray value. And the halftone is incredibly important. So I don't want transition from light to dark to be just a sharp line. I want it to be clear. I don't want it to be a kind of like Photoshop gradation where you can't tell the difference between the light and shadow. At the same time, I want it to be subtle, and I want it to be the kind of transition that you see on a round form such as the one. So I've mixed up a middle tone between the light and the dark, and I'm just laying that tone in along the shadow edge, bringing it back half. And so that halftone is just transitioning, it's rolling that shadow into the light. So that transition starts to seem round like this. I'm going to feather that halftone into the light. Soft transition. Over the light And I can take one of my blending brushes, softening that transition. So now we've indicated the half tone. I could work on that more. It's not. I could continue to make that more subtle. But what's another? So we talked about the light, the dark, light mask, dark mask, cast shadow, which we've got. We started to indicate the occlusion shadow. We've brought in some of the halftone. What's another element of light and shadow that we talked about?
Maybe the highlights?
There is highlight, right? So we could, I wouldn't paint the highlight now, but there is highlight, so we might as well do that. So the highlight, so where's the highlight? I see the highlight running right around here. It's about a third of the way over from the left-hand contour. So I'm going to get a little bit more white paint. I'm going to paint highlight right in. The highlight is starts to fade off down the bottom. Oh. So I'm looking carefully where on the form the highlight is. And now I'm going to start to pay attention to how softly it transitions into the center line around it. So it's not just it's not a sharp band of light. It blends in, softens into the center line around it. So the main light source we often call the center light. And center line and then there's the highlight. What's another element of light and shadow? So you have light mask, dark mask. Got the highlight.
Reflected light.
Reflected light. So we want to find the reflected light in the core of the shadow. So before I do that, I'm just softening some of these transitions a little bit. Just going in and softening that halftone transition. So you want a soft transition, but you still want to maintain the clarity of light and shadow. You want to bring in that halftone. Now, so I need to indicate that there's a reflected light there. So one option is to make the shadow a little bit lighter where I'm seeing the reflected light. But I can also possibly, depending on what I need to do, or depending on the specifics of my painting, I may be able to make that reflected light by actually bringing in the core of the shadow. So remember, the core of the shadow is that darker band of shadow along the shadow edge, along that terminal. And since when I look at my setup, or if you look at your image, the reflected light value is the same as the surface of the table behind the cone. Those are the same value. And right now in my painting, the reflected light value of the cone is the same as the surface of the table behind it. So I'm not going to light the reflected light. I'm actually going to darken the core of the shadow. And by doing that, create that sense of the reflected light. So I'm going to make the reflected light, the core of the shadow in my painting, just a little bit darker than the reflected light. So I need to mix just slightly darker, a value just slightly darker than the reflected light value. And I'm going to just sort of touch that in, or scrub that in. So it's just that band of shadow. It's just a little bit darker than the reflected light. And so I'm feathering that in, just like I feathered in those other tones, or trying to feather it in. Now we're starting to get a real sense of this form wrapping around the screens, right? As we start to progressively add those elements of light and shadow, volume more and more convincingly starts to wrap around in space. I can continue to refine this more and more. So that the values are a little bit choppy somewhere, like right here. I don't like that little chop of value. I would continue to work on this. I'll bring in, I'll emphasize strongly. Highlight. And at this point, we have all of the main elements of the lights and shadows blocked in. So I'll continue now to refine them. I can also now start to look for any subtlety in the setting around this still life. I would start to try and get rid of the slightly darker halo. Artificiality. I would just continue now to refine all values as much as it's possible. So the left hand contour of the comb is a little wobbly, so straighten that. I'm not going to torture you long by continuing to refine these things. I would certainly work on it. But those are the basic elements we want to look for. So again, you want to, so the painting to do for next week, you want to set up a simple situation like I have here. That's a bad image. And try to do as accurate a painting of the values that you see in the setup as you can. Okay. Remembering to start with as accurate a proportional drawing as the setup, and then carefully observing the values of lights and darks in the setup in front of you. Does that make sense? And this will be a little bit of we'll see how much work people are able to get done. So is that clear for next week, the assignment for next week? Are there any questions?
So I'll end the video there. The assignment is the same as I just described on this video. So I'll just pull up that image I sent everybody this morning. So, darn, what did I do with it? So you want to set up your cone you want to set it up in a box like I've done here. And again, the reason for that is, the reason to use a box is that we're probably working in situations, we're all working at home. So we probably do not have a room we can work in where the lighting situation is ideal. What a box allows you to do is set up your object and then essentially block light from most directions, except for the one direction that you decide your light is shining from. So you do want to get that box. You do want to set your object up in the box and make sure that you have the light positioned so that you have a clear light and then dark, a clearly observable dark section of the object. You don't want to position the light too much in the front so that the entire object is illuminated. You want to have both light and dark. So the dark section should be at least a quarter or a third of the object itself. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
If I can clarify anything about that, just let me know. I do want to show you one last thing. I didn't do it last semester, and I'm not going to be able to give you like a full description, but so I do strongly recommend that you clean your brushes at the end of every session. So you clean them first using your mineral spirits. So using your container of mineral spirits, you get as much paint out as you can. And then I strongly recommend cleaning them with soap and water at the end of your session. And the reason for that is, one, the brushes will last much longer if you get as much of the paint out of them as possible. And I think for most people's purposes, a brush that you keep clean, you're just going to be able to get more out of it, in the sense that you'll be able to get more techniques out of the brush than if you let the brush get sort of brittle with dry paint. So I just recommend, I'm not going to be able to show you this at a sink, although maybe I'll do a demo like this, but you just want to get like a pump bottle of soap or a bar of soap. So put some in your hand when you're cleaning your brushes, and then with the soap in your hand, just move the brush back and forth in a way that you're not contradicting the direction of the bristles. So you want to move the brush in a way that reinforces the direction of the bristles. You'll just get, you can push all the dirty paint out of the brush when there's soap in there, get all of the paint out and then just rinse off the brush, reshape it and leave it to dry. Again, there are some artists who prefer, and their paintings in a sense require them to use like sort of brittle old brushes. But I think for the most part, that's not going to be the case given the paintings we're doing in this class. So again, I strongly recommend taking 5 or 10 minutes to clean your brushes at the end of every painting session. Any questions about anything else? So I will have all of those documents I referred to today up on Blackboard. I'll have a few instructional documents, like I have a document about how to draw an ellipse. I'll have those images that show the elements of light and shadow. I'll have the image of the painting I did in that demo. I'll have the demo itself in today's class session. So I'll get those all up by the end of the day, and a full verbal description of the assignment for next week. So again, for next week, you just want to set up your simple cone in a box. You want to light it in a way similar to how I had the cone lit, and just try your best to make a convincing painting of the cone, carefully observing light, carefully observing the values in the setup, and then finding those elements of light and shadow that we talked about today. Okay. So just please upload the image to Blackboard. Ideally by next week. If anyone needs a couple more days, I'm not, I don't get uptight about that. You don't want to get, you don't want to get too behind so that you have too much to catch up on. And if there aren't any questions, we'll end for today. You can certainly email me at any time during the week if there are any follow-ups. So can I answer any questions?
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Whoever spoke first, you can go.
I just wanted to know where on Blackboard you wanted us to upload the photo of the painting, if it was like a discussion board or what.
It's called the Grading Center. I mean, it should be, it's on the left-hand bar of Blackboard. When I go to Blackboard, I would think it's there for you. If it's not, just let me know. Are you looking at Blackboard now?
I am, yeah.
You not see it? On the left-hand control panel, I guess they call it. Do you see Grading Center or Assignments?
No. I believe assignments might be under tools.
Okay, I'll pull up my Blackboard and then share my screen. And I don't know why my computer's so slow today. Sorry, I know I entered it wrong. So is this what, now it may, since I'm the faculty member, it may be different. This is what I have, and then under control panel, I have grade center. Do you not have that?
No, we don't.
Okay. Okay, so to be honest with you, I don't know. I guess I don't know the answer to that question just because I have a different Blackboard. I mean, most people have always, there really haven't been problems. If you can't, let me find out. I mean, if people could, just everyone should let me know if you can't find where to upload it. I'll figure it out. It's just, you can send me a JPEG of your image. That's fine. It's just much easier and cleaner if you want to follow your grades as I post them. Do you know what I mean? But I can still do it even if you just have to send me a JPEG. So until we figure it out, maybe for now, just send me a JPEG. Is that okay?
Yeah. That's fine.
Okay. And there was another question.
Yeah, do you want us to take a picture of the cone and our painting, or just the
Oh,
painting?
yes. Thank you for asking me. Yeah, it's helpful to me if you could take a photograph both of your setup, so whatever that is from week to week. So this week, the cone. So take a photograph of that and your painting and submit them both. Thanks for reminding me.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'll see everybody next week.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Take care.
See you all soon.
Thank you, Professor.
Hey, Professor.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. Can I send you an email?
Sure.
I had a question about the assignments and the special projects and the previous question that I asked and how that
yeah, Mitchell, I apologize. I realized this morning that I didn't answer your last email. But your plan to do, I think you said 23 covers. Yeah, that's totally fine. Or what did you say? You're going to do the whole book?
The whole pages. I was thinking of fully rendered.
Yeah, that's
paintings.
fine. That's fine. That sounds good. So the project as you described it, I support that. Let's work with that.
Okay.
The only thing I think, as you know, I am not a comic book illustrator. Like, I don't work in that field, so I can give you feedback, to the best of my ability, but it's not something I do. So,
it's fully painted would just be you're a realist painter, so it's pretty much the same thing. If
right,
and typically they're not fully painted unless someone takes the time. But that's only because there was a 1 month time constraint, but occasionally they are. So I figured that would be.
Well, also contemporary comics, I mean, I don't do them, but I look at them, and contemporary comics do use the principles of classical painting that we're talking about. So you'll be able to apply it for sure.
Okay. And
in a way, comic book artists really inherited the tradition of representational painting, from artists like the artists we looked at today, Ang, Vermeer, Michelangelo. They adapted those techniques. So the things we learn in this class will definitely be applicable. I just don't myself do comic books.
Well, usually the coloring or painting, I guess you could call it, it's basically simplified painting. It's not fully rendered painting, the coloring. So, but sometimes they are fully rendered. So I figured, I'll just produce fully rendered paintings.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay.
Okay. All right. And
do you still want me to do the cone?
You don't have to, Mitchell, you don't have to. If you want to, I'm thrilled to look at it and talk to you about it. But if you want to just concentrate on your independent work, that's fine too.
And show you a paint. Okay. I'll send you a painting.
Okay. That sounds.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.